with a bang. Energy and change.
Welcome to CNBC Evolve, exploring the ideas and innovations leading the way to a more sustainable future. CNBC's Evolve livestream is sponsored by Accenture. Now, here's Leslie Picker.
And welcome to CNBC's Evolve. Thanks for bearing with us while we sorted out a few tech issues, but today we're taking an in-depth look at ESG and D, which stands for environmental, social, governance, and diversity. 4 separate criteria used by socially conscious investors and shareholders to screen investments and assess a company's impact on the world, all of which is becoming increasingly important to corporate America. Now, coming up, we'll hear from the president and CEO of the Executive Leadership Council on navigating the challenges facing underrepresented professionals in the workplace, and from the head of corporate strategy at BlackRock on how the financial giant is taking bold and progressive steps toward a net zero economy. But first, let's shine a spotlight on the E in ESG and how companies can be responsible stewards of nature. One organization leading the way is Terracycle, a global recycling company, which has partnered with the likes of Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Nestle to eliminate billions and billions of tons of plastic waste through consumer recycling initiative called Loop. Now, CEO Tom Szaky is here to tell us more about this truly innovative, sustainable movement that's taken hold across so many companies. Tom, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. So first, I just want to kick things off with this whole concept of sustainability and recycling in and of itself, because there was a John Oliver episode a few weeks ago, which said that basically recycling plastic, 90% of it actually goes into the garbage anyway. There was an NPR podcast, which said that, recycling is no longer in demand from places like China, where we used to export our recycled goods to. And so is that incorrect? This fear that our recycled goods actually just wind up in landfills anyway?
No, I think it's both those examples that you mentioned are absolutely rooted in facts. And I think the important thing to take a step on it, and this is very empowering, is what makes something actually be recycled in a country. And it doesn't have to do with what we normally think, which is, can that object be recycled? Instead, it has to do with, can a garbage company, the actual company who's in charge of doing the recycling in that geography, can they recycle that object at a profit? And what's happening is the profitability is decreasing. Oil prices have gone down starting in 2015 and maintained. You mentioned, for example, China stopped importing waste, followed by other countries in 2018. All these things are hurting the business construct for recycling companies. And that means that our recycling capabilities are deteriorating. On the flip side, though, consumers are caring more, companies are leaning in. So there's this gap that's forming between what people would like to see happen and what is happening behind the scenes.
So how does that work then? So if companies are taking more of a role in changing the economics of recycling, then does it matter that the business model itself is no longer as profitable as it once was? Or do you kind of need both things to operate in tandem?
Well, I think they are both critically important. The business model of recycling is sort of like the health of the infrastructure. And how much is it desiring to collect those material types? Now, what businesses can do to help that, but you have to honor that as the most important dependency is, first, create products that when they end up in our waste stream are what recyclers want versus don't want. So goods that are easier to recycle, create higher value outputs, and so on. In addition, companies can fund programs on their own. It's what our entire Terracycle business is based on, is companies voluntarily funding whatever it costs to collect and process a waste stream versus the residual value. And then there's also the ability for companies to get together and form consortiums like the US Plastic Pact, and even potentially lobby for legislation that helps effectively rise the tide on all boats. But all of these come down to injecting capital into the infrastructure, because recycling is not out there trying to do the best it can. It's trying to maximize profit, and we have to really think about that as we aim towards a more circular economy, which is quite important.
So let's talk about this idea of maximizing profit and the love-hate relationship that goal has with doing good for the world. When you think about companies that are looking to, decrease their footprint when it comes to creating products that can't be recycled, is it possible to do it in a way that also maximizes profit? Or is it something that helps the top line because it's what consumers are asking for? I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but also, is that true across the board?
It's an excellent question. And if you look at the macroeconomic challenges, what are we doing? We're trying to reduce cost in products and packages. And as we reduce cost, we are objectively reducing value, which also makes them less recyclable. So the biggest mega trend in global packaging today is lightweighting. And when you lightweight a package, you make it physically have less material and typically more complexity, which means they become progressively less recyclable or less profitable to recycle. Now, what's really important is companies decide to lean in on this and think about how can they do something like creating their own recycling programs, whether it's a retailer or a brand. If you just frame this in let's do it because it's the right thing to do, typically the funding level that will be attained is going to be small and sporadic because there is no P&L logic to do it. But if it can be framed in, if you're a retailer, running a recycling program to help drive foot traffic, like Staples does with us with pens in Canada, or a Walmart with car seats in the United States, that gets consumers in the store, and that can be very monetizable. Or if brands run their own recycling programs, funding the cost of what it costs to collect and process this material, they may be able to drive market share. They may be able to drive brand preference. And the more that one can tease out ways that these sustainability endeavors become monetizable in a recognizable way, the bigger they become and the faster they can grow. And I think that's actually for a truth for more than just recycling, but any sustainability endeavor that you're looking to implement in the short term.
Okay, so your business, this is the whole business model, is helping companies think creatively about how they can be more sustainable and help contribute to the environment in a positive way. Let's break that down a little bit and start maybe with what you're doing at Terracycle, looking at whether or not objects are recyclable and making it more convenient for consumers to do.
Absolutely. So in our Terracycle division, we first do exactly what you described. So we look at waste streams that are today not locally recyclable. And the backdrop there is what makes, say, a dirty diaper or a cigarette butt or a even toothbrush not locally recyclable. It's not that it can't be, but it costs more to collect and process than the results are worth. So what we do is we work with, say, a manufacturer or a retailer or some stakeholder that cares about that waste stream more than another. They fund the actual cost of collecting and processing that waste stream minus whatever we can sell the results for. And then to make that work and scale, what we really focus hard is how does that help them drive their core business? How does, say, pen recycling help a retailer get more foot traffic? How does it help drive market share? How does it help drive things that can be very monetizable? And when that happens, magic can occur. We recently launched diaper recycling, for example, with Pampers in Holland. And because it showed exactly that, that's now expanding to many countries around the world. And on the surface, diaper recycling doesn't make economic sense. It's expensive to collect them and expensive to process versus what the results are worth. But if that can help drive core business value, maybe it's better to invest in diaper recycling than TV commercials.
That's interesting. So the idea that there are enough consumers out there that would appreciate the ability to recycle their diapers versus get the idea of buying diapers on TV, that calculation is, you think, part of the same marketing budget?
It's the same backdrop, yes. And I think, people want to do the right thing. We also acknowledge we're in an environmental crisis right now. So stakeholders and companies want to be able to use the great power of corporations to be able to do the right thing versus something perhaps benign like just general marketing. But they need to see that it's not just an investment in doing the right thing, but it's also going to pay back. And we've seen that work over and over and over again in many different industries, from B2B to B2C. It absolutely does play out. And it's also showing up in consumer sentiment. Consumers really are caring more and more about the environment than ever before. COVID, in fact, accentuated that because we are consuming 30 to 50% more disposable goods during COVID. We're recycling less. So people are seeing the issue, and they're benefiting companies that are leaning in on this. And while our macro waste management systems are suffering economically, there are ways to solve this that don't rely on just government intervention or other systems doing it.
Are there enough opportunities to recycle to make a difference? Meaning, are there enough use cases for all of the waste that we consume to really make a dent here? And is it a matter of the will to actually do this, or is it science? Is it possible to just get rid of all this waste?
I think if you looked at what are the bottlenecks to recycling scaling, the biggest bottleneck by far is business model, right? Most of the things that we put in our blue bin that are not recycled or we put on our trash can directly are just things that garbage companies can't make money on. So Terracycle is an example of a way to solve for that, but there needs to be way more business models that enable it. That's the true bottleneck. Once that is enabled, then we have to worry about consumers caring. Like even in the United States where, say, soda bottle recycling is at scale, the business model works, we still only recycle 1 in 4 bottles. And a big part of that is consumer apathy. Now, that is something that we can really work on through education and excitement, and then to keep that moving. Because if you think about the individual's journey towards sustainability, it always begins with recycling. And once you have that, then you may move to a plant-based diet instead of animal protein, or you may live a smaller life, or you may bike to work, or other things that will create even more important outcomes. But we first have to solve the business model. That is the dependency. And then we can really focus on scaling. Now, the white elephant in the room is this is not the answer to garbage. The fundamental answer is modulating our consumption downward. But that's very difficult for business to champion because that is fundamentally degrowth.
Yeah, that was something that I think the John Oliver episode hit on with regard to plastic bottles, that it is in nobody's best interest to tell people to stop consuming. It's not in Pepsi or Coca-Cola's best interest to tell consumers to stop drinking Pepsi. It's in their best interest to tell them just to recycle their bottles, which obviously depends on the convenience for the individual consumer to do so. When we chatted last week, you mentioned a really interesting recycling idea. And honestly, I had no idea that this even existed, but using, recyclables that are at very, very high altitudes to make watches.
Yes, absolutely. So our second division at Terracycle focuses not on how do we collect and recycle waste, but how do we help companies make their products from waste. And there's an issue today. There's a lot of companies wanting to use recycled content, but everyone uses the same material. If it's something like PET, the plastic that makes up a soda bottle, everyone's using municipally sourced soda bottles to make, whether it's a carpet or a t-shirt or a backpack. And that leaves our aquatic systems, our natural environments, our inner cities polluted. And so here what we do is deploy the power of story, whether it's making, say, ocean plastic bottles with Procter & Gamble and Unilever, all the way to a project we just recently kicked off where we're working with a luxury Swiss watch company to clean up the top of Mount Everest, which actually is also a landfill with abandoned oxygen tanks and heating elements, and using the power of that story to enable such a cleanup, which isn't cheap to do. But perhaps when you're shopping for a watch, you may prefer the steel from the top of Everest than a gold band, and maybe that story creates the luxury that then enables for the cleanups to occur.
For people like me who will most likely never climb Mount Everest, it would be a very cool story to tell friends that the watch comes from, one of the tallest places on Earth. So that is obviously a very creative way to do things. The third part of your business involves Loop, which is all about reuse and coming up with new ways to ensure that there is less garbage from the consumer. How does that relate to what you're doing with regard to recycling and what you're doing with regard to changing the input in various consumer products?
Absolutely. So I think recycling, I say this as a recycling company, is not the answer to garbage. It's an answer to the symptom of garbage, right? Maybe the best way to manage waste. But I think we have to go much deeper and enable an economy where garbage doesn't exist, which, mind you, was the case until the 1950s. And before the 50s, we received our milk from the milkman. We cobbled our shoes. We mended our clothes. We lived a very different life in relationship with durability and reusability. Now, reuse does exist at scale today. In the United States, our beer kegs are highly reusable, as are our propane tanks. But you can't take the propane tank to the beer store when it's empty, and vice versa. You can't do the beer keg to the place you got your propane tank. And so Loop is a platform for reuse where consumer product companies can join and create beautiful reusable versions of their products. Not only are Nestle and P&G now investors, but 150 major consumer product companies have joined. And then retailers, like Kroger, Walgreens, and 15 others around the world make them available to their consumers, trying to create an ecosystem where you can buy anywhere and return anywhere. Later this year, you'll be able to buy your favorite shampoo bottle at Walgreens in New York in reusable packaging, and then drop it off at a Burger King, where you can then buy, hopefully, your Impossible Whopper and soda in reusable packaging and drop it off somewhere else. So creating a framework that makes reusability as convenient, ideally, as disposability.
Now, convenience is key here, and remembering, because people are busy and people have got places to be, and so how are you, or what are you hearing from consumers with regard to their appetite to do all of this? Recycling is one thing. I think you and I were both children of the 80s, and that was just all over the place. You learn in school, you're supposed to recycle. There were the recycling bins outside of everybody's house. It was just kind of part of the culture back then. But this kind of takes it to a new level. Obviously no one wants to harm the environment with their behavior, but how much are people willing to actually spend the time, do the research, figure out where to go, and take that extra step?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. And I think first, consumer behavior change is incredibly difficult. And a lot of sustainability relies on fundamental consumer behavior change. And I think that's what we want to actually avoid versus relying on it. So we believe the number one goal is convenience in these platforms, and meet the convenience of throwing something away. Then to give consumers amazing features and benefits, which reusable packaging does. It objectively upgrades the package versus disposable alternatives. And then to give all that, the convenience and those features at the right value. And with all three of those things coming together, you can switch consumers who may not even care about sustainability. And that's frankly the most important, because we got to bring everyone along, not just people who view this as a high passion topic.
That's a really good point, that it is first and foremost about convenience in order to make a difference, because you're right, not everybody has this at the front of their minds in the way that you do. But we're glad that you have it at the forefront of your mind, because you've shared some valuable insights with us today. And we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much, Tom Szaky, CEO of Loop and Terracycle. We really appreciate your time and your comments today. We will be right back with Michael Hyder of the Executive Leadership Council and BlackRock's Jessica Tan. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere.
With a bang, energy and change came to every part of our universe. Seismic or small, it continues.
Change is all around us, shaped by technology and human ingenuity. We can make it work for you and your business.
Hello, I'm Jill Standish. I'm the global lead for retail here at Accenture. No one in retail could have predicted a year quite like the one we just experienced. And while much remains still very uncertain, it's vital that retailers take the opportunity to reset. And they need to do this reset responsibly, having ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, at the core of how they're resetting. We here at Accenture have identified 5 priorities for how to do this reset responsibly in the post-pandemic world. First, the digital strategy, because digital comes with a higher cost to serve today. And it's obvious that these environmental impacts due to packaging and transportation put sustainability really at the forefront. Second, fulfillment, exploring local options and make customers part of a greener last mile by educating them about the carbon footprint of their delivery choices. Third, sourcing. Lean, agile, and responsible ESG practices in the supply chain are critical because customers want on-product sustainability information. Fourth, talent. Creating a purpose-driven culture that sustains equality, equity, inclusion, and diversity, where everyone feels they have a chance to thrive. And finally, data. To drive decision-making and measure impact to people and the planet. Now is the moment to adopt ESG practices that will allow companies to rebuild, and rebuild for the better.
Welcome back. I am joined by Michael Hyder, the Executive Leadership Council head, former Chief Diversity Officer at Korn Ferry. The Executive Leadership Council is a nonprofit which is dedicated to increasing the number of global Black executives in C-suites, in boards, and various enterprises. Its membership includes current and former Black CEOs, executives, board directors, entrepreneurs. Mike, you've been a member for 27 years. And I just wanted to start with a broad question, looking at kind of the state of corporate America and diversity as it stands. Just some statistics so that we can level set before beginning. Less than 2% of executives at the 50 largest companies in the US are Black. That's according to USA Today. And of the 27,000 board members within the Russell 3000, 5.4% are Black. And there are 60% of the Russell 3000, that's almost 2/3 of companies, that have no Black board members at all. Obviously, that is a fraction of the proportion of the US population that is Black. Why is there such a disconnect? Why do you think there is such a gap right now?
Well, Leslie, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and you clearly have done your homework. I think it's a combination of over conservatism as it relates to developing Black talent with organizations, and I don't necessarily mean maliciously, but just a sense of being overly cautious about giving people who are Black opportunities for taking risks. I also think that there is an under indexing of real quality development of talent, particularly talent that is ethnically different in organizations, that seems to be lacking in companies, which has a lot to do with those outcomes that you just referenced. I'm hopeful that I see momentum that's increasing in that area more recently than in the past. But the direct answer to your question is, I believe it's a lack of development and taking risk issue.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that point, because you used the term risk, the lack of risk taking. Why is it a risk to hire and promote and recruit people who are diverse, people who are Black?
Yeah. Well, I personally don't think it's a risk, but I think that the statistics would suggest the perception, and let me state it this way, because I think there's a little bit of well-intended protection, but there is clearly a difference in one group being perceived as being successful when given opportunities that have risk associated with it, and other groups who are perceived as needing more time to demonstrate capabilities before risks are taken on them. That creates that disparity. And I found with white males in particular, the presumption of success is typically behind a lot of the decisions that are made when people are promoted that happen to look like that. And the presumptions of needing more time before you want to take a risk of failure that might be visible is the basis for why Black talent may not be positioned the same way. So I mean it in that context when I use the term risk.
Is there a difference, because you look at increasing the number of Black voices on, from both a C-suite standpoint as well as a board standpoint, is there a difference when it comes to hurdles in achieving your goal in the C-suite versus boards? And which would you place a higher priority on in terms of making a bigger difference in corporate America? Is it getting more Black executives on the boards, or is it getting them in positions of managerial roles, in executive roles within companies, and effectuating change that way?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, I believe that operational responsibility at the highest levels within an organization is the ticket to increasing the development, sponsorship, and promotability ratio that I'm referencing, that really makes a difference in advancing Black talent. I think Black board member representation is a significant, important element to the overall picture. And candidly, that's been one area where that growth has been much more dramatic in the past 12 months or so than the other. But in my view, the more Blacks who are in the C-suite, specifically being developed with profit and loss experiences as an opportunity, you increase the probability of people who happen to be Black who are in a position to ultimately run companies, which would fundamentally change the game in terms of the development of talent, in my view, in the organization. So I think it's more of a C-suite pipeline issue as the primary driver of success in this regard, but more Blacks on boards is also helpful.
In terms of, reflecting on the past year, there are a lot of companies that are facing, whether inward or external, a ton of pressure to improve their diversity metrics. And in response to that, many have set quotas and other types of goals. How do you think companies should be thinking about ensuring successful outcomes for the new hires that companies are making as a result of these new goals, as in opposition to, not just to check the box diversity mandate, but really making sure that people who are hired and are more diverse than the companies have traditionally had are actually set up for success at those companies?
Well, I think that the, oh my goodness. I think a more transparency relative to what your picture looks like in terms of percentages of Blacks in roles is a step in the right direction, so that because transparency increases information among stakeholders, and also it increases more of accountability metric when people, you're being open about what your opportunities are and when things are in the open, accountability is different. I think secondly, the being really deliberate about a robust leadership and development program, and being intentional about reducing what might be headwinds for Black professionals based on the fact that if they're underrepresented, there must be headwinds in the environment that aren't noticeable, that need to be at least addressed. And then thirdly, I think this being, as I stated earlier, being intentional about wanting to make a specific difference and incenting things that would increase the probability of that success. So you referenced earlier about quotas for the sake of quotas as what to avoid, which I happen to agree with. I mean, you shouldn't incent numbers purely for numbers' sake, because then it becomes more of a numbers game. But I think incenting leaders around promotion rates or pipeline representation of people who are in position to be promoted in 2 to 3 years, that happens to be a mosaic of ethnic and sexual orientation and gender representation. And in our case, I'm folk fixated primarily on the Black experience, which tends to be the one percentage that seems to be in decline more than any other group at the C-suite level. Just being transparent and being deliberate about development versus just fixated on hiring, and then, literally incenting leaders, to be deliberate about making a difference with a population that's underrepresented, I think will make a huge difference here.
Yeah, it sounds like step one is awareness, but not just, thinking that your job is done, once you make these hires, encouraging them to flourish at the company and ensure that they are succeeding and thriving and making a difference and achieving all of those diversity goals that you are looking for, not just numerically, but also more of the cultural aspects and the qualitative aspects as well. This has been a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate you joining us. Mike Hyder of the Executive Leadership Council, thank you so much for participating today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Leslie. It's good to see you.
With over $9 trillion in assets under management, when BlackRock talks, the world listens, which is why when the financial giant moved forcefully and profoundly to embrace sustainable investments, investors, clients, and governments embrace their challenge in meaningful ways. Jessica Tan, BlackRock's global head of corporate strategy, has played an integral role in the firm's plan for net zero economy. She joins me now. Jessica, thank you so much for being here today. I want to start with the issue of data, because this is a key point that investors and corporations and everybody who's in the business world, you either love data or you don't love it but need to embrace it anyway because it's a key part of your job. As it currently stands, would you say that the availability of reliable, consistent, comparable data across companies as it pertains to ESG is fit for investor decision making? ESG meaning environmental social governance.
Yeah, great. Leslie, thank you for having me here today. You know, we spend so much of our time focused on data and of course what it means for portfolios. And what I would say is, you know, it's a journey. And, you know, there's both, you know, too much and not enough data in certain ways, but it is fit to make investment decisions today. When I say there's too much, you know, there's, you know, so many stats about the proliferation of data in general. So there's a lot of unstructured data out there, and not all of it might make sense. However, what's wonderful is we've developed a lot of different techniques to be able to sort through that and understand what actually has material impacts into investment decisions. At the same time, sometimes it feels in certain pockets there might not be enough. And the reason I say that is there's been so much acceleration and momentum in the voluntary disclosures that corporations make in terms of sustainability statistics over the last couple of years, and that's really wonderful. You know, however, it's still not quite 100% there yet, and you know, private companies aren't 100% there yet. But you know, we're really motivated by the amount of actions that corporations are taking. You know, we've been talking and calling for disclosure through the TCFD framework and also SASB and comparable frameworks for some time now. And the more that corporations are consistent and you know, the more that corporations are globally consistent, the more we can have that reliable, you know, deep and you know, meaningful data to be able to compare and make investment decisions.
What do you think is the biggest hurdle to that consistency so far? Why isn't that we haven't seen a SASB, you know, standardization put into effect at this point? You know, what's holding this back?
It's a great question. Well, one, it's hard. These things aren't easy, right? So, I mean, these are complicated and nuanced. We want to make sure that the data has integrity, and corporations do too. So I do believe that, you know, the number of commitments that corporations have made in terms of disclosure, some of it understanding the direction of travel by the standard setters, you know, SEC, who's out there. We believe that the direction of travel is to get there. However, you know, we deal with it too at BlackRock. I mean, to put together these reports, it's cross-functional, it takes time, and people care that these are, you know, accurate and meaningful and will tell a story through time. So it's not that people aren't trying to do it, it's just that, you know, with any change, any regime change, it takes some time to implement.
Without standardization of data, some critics argue that the category of ESG it's simply a marketing exercise. What is the role of the investor to hold companies accountable to their ESG promises, and what limitations do you experience in that goal that kind of is giving these critics fodder to call this basically, you know, greenwashing essentially?
Well, look, first and foremost, we're a fiduciary for our clients, right? So we act on their behalf. So we think about this topic all the time. So when we engage with companies and hold companies to a certain standard, it's to do so for the long-term valuation of companies in which we invest in on behalf of our clients. So we take it, you know, we take our responsibility very seriously to make sure that corporations are making the best long-term decisions. You know, and in terms of greenwashing, we agree. You know, if companies don't hold themselves to certain standards, and if the transparency and consistency isn't there, you know, we do believe that greenwashing could be a risk, which is why we take this very seriously, to hold not only ourselves, but the companies in which we invest in to a certain standard, to make sure the data is comparable and it's consistent.
Is there such a thing as a perfect company when it comes to ESG? Because it seems like, when you think about ESG, it's companies that are doing right by the environment. They're doing right by their constituents and their stakeholders, whether it's their employees or their suppliers, their vendors, their shareholders. They're doing right by governance. It seems like we're holding companies to a really high standard, whereas previously it's been just, make a lot of money, which comparably might be an easier standard. Is it possible for a company to do good by all of these areas and really maintain that over time?
Leslie, that's a great question. I think for us, it's becoming more and more clear that the companies who do the right thing by their stakeholders are also positioning themselves for long-term success and therefore long-term financial performance. And that's what we care about from the lens of a fiduciary. The thing is, the companies that are well positioned for the overall transition, whether it's energy transition or just more awareness for all of the social impact factors, the ability to do that is a lot more nuanced. And so we're spending a lot more time working with companies to understand how prepared they are for this transition. I think with all of the commitments that governments are making, corporations are making to be able to get to this net zero world, it's clear to us that things have to change in business models, supply chains. That will have an effect on the real economy, which will have an effect on business models, financial instruments, and then therefore portfolios. However, understanding how prepared they are, it's not a simple exercise. And so we're really trying to figure out if companies do have a plan in place to position themselves well for this energy transition, because the transition is coming. And as with other transitions in the past, companies that are prepared will succeed, and companies that won't do as well. And that's really important for us to discern from the perspective of an asset manager.
And I want to go a little bit deeper into this idea because what do you do if a company doesn't have a plan? I know there's a lot of nuance in ESG investing with regard to divestment of companies that are, considered by ESG standards, maybe bad actors. But other investors take the approach that, we won't divest our shares. In fact, we are going to see our role as a fiduciary and as an investor and have a say in the way this company is governed, use that as an opportunity to help them through this transition and guide them through what could make them a better company. What's the approach that you think works the best? Is it divestment, threat of divestment, or staying invested and being more of a vocal advocate for a transition toward the goals that you've set forth?
Yeah, look, I think divestment is a very blunt instrument and it might suit certain client sets. However, I think the more nuanced and advanced conversation where, sustainability is going is to understand companies' transition plans and not necessarily make rules-based divestment choices. I think if you have an opportunity to engage with a company, right, I think from our experience, they obviously want to do well, in the future as well, which is very much aligned with our overall objectives. So to be able to understand, how are they planning? What scenario are they making their business plan under? How are they prepared? How are they actually going to change their overall business models and better prepare? Understanding that transition is probably one of the hardest things that we're facing in sustainability now. Right? People estimate that there's $50 trillion of investments necessary to get from today to a net zero world. That has to come from somewhere. Companies have to be better prepared. They have to change business models. They have to, retire certain things that might be online faster than they had originally anticipated. And, and to be able to understand that, for us, that's investment opportunity for our clients. So, it's a really hard thing. I don't think that, hardline divestments are necessarily, the most obvious place to go, either if you're trying to make a difference for the environment itself, because if you're divesting, you might be selling to somebody else and those emissions still might exist in the environment, nor are divestments necessarily the most obvious choice when you're looking for financial opportunity. Because, some of the most innovative approaches, are coming from, let's say oil and gas companies who are invested in clean technologies. They're invested in, renewables or some decarbonization strategies, and other oil and gas companies aren't evolving as quickly. And to have that information, understanding the transition plans, is just so much of how we can add value to our clients' portfolios.
You bring up a really good point with that $50 trillion number. It's shocking, although it's only 5 times BlackRock's AUM. So when you put it in that perspective, especially by 2050, it's not completely out there. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, it's an enormous sum of money. But how realistic is it to expect the private sector to go about doing that spending on their own? And how much do they need encouragement, whether it's from a regulatory standpoint or a public-private partnership standpoint, from the public sector to help achieve those goals?
Leslie, I think that's a great question. I mean, 50 trillion, as you said, is a lot of money. And if you look at the, Biden administration, the fact that, we've promised to cut emissions by half versus 2005 by 2030, those investment dollars per year are large. And I don't think this is either a private sector or just public sector. It's clear that it has to be both. Private sector dollars are going to have to move there to fill a funding gap that currently exists. And, I think the more that we can partner, whether it's, guidance, regulation, clarity from, the government, or in some cases partnering and actually investments, whether it's infrastructure and others, I think that's the only way to be able to fill that funding gap in a way to be able to meet these net zero goals that many, many countries are now setting.
When you hear those numbers and the capex required by a lot of companies, I have to wonder, is this something that companies should be doing now in this bull market? Because ultimately, and we saw a little bit of a crisis over the last year, a pretty significant crisis, but it was in hindsight somewhat short-lived. But obviously these things are cyclical, and especially in areas that are a bit more exposed to the economy, are companies that are making that transition. Should they be taking advantage of this current market and making these choices and decisions and investments now, as opposed to waiting, until it becomes a little bit more imminent? Although that could be a worse market to be making those transitions if they're less cash rich, for example.
Leslie, I think that's great advice. The answer is yes. I think companies should be focused on it now, not only because, their balance sheets might be in slightly better positions than last year, but also because to be able to make these goals by 2050, it's not something you start, 10 years from now, or certainly not 20 years from now. It takes time to make these decisions today to be able to, move the capital stock in a place to be able to meet these 2050 goals. Interestingly, though, last year, I have to admit, when COVID first hit, we just made these large pledges in sustainability. We'd written 30 different promises and commitments that we wanted to accomplish in 2020. I was nervous that with everything, going on with COVID, that people weren't going to be able to focus on sustainability as much. Interestingly, and maybe slightly counterintuitively, the exact opposite happened. Now, obviously, last year we also saw just so much, climate events, or so many climate events that really made visible the physical impact on corporations and the physical and climate risk that exists. So I think people were able to refocus. Similarly, just so many events about racial injustice and equity, especially here in the US, were really raised to the forefront. And so I think ESG last year, despite some counterintuitive dynamics, really became top of mind. And so in a year like this, where things are a little bit better, obviously uneven, but still a little bit better versus last year. We're seeing companies focus on this so much more for the exact reasons you mentioned. And also we're seeing our clients focus on sustainability a lot more, even more than last year.
Do we ever get to the point where the term ESG just becomes extinct, that it's so pervasive, it's so a part of business and corporate culture and the mindset of business as a whole, that we just don't even use that term? We don't even look at that term anymore because it's just so ingrained in the fabric of what makes business function.
We at BlackRock, I feel like we're already there. For us, it's table stakes. We look at sustainability risk the same way we would look at credit risk or liquidity risk. We monitor it the same and report on it the same, right? We have published certain sustainability metrics for all of our funds and ETFs that are out there. And so in that way, you're right, it's just ingrained in the fabric of what we do. However, looking forward, I do think that there's also just so much demand from clients to think about what sustainability means for them and how it applies to their portfolios. So I do think that, as we grow and as we find out more, there's an increasing demand for, kind of customized solutions in sustainability. So I do think that, it might not be every asset tomorrow, but, I do think that other asset managers are going to be moving the same direction as us, and ingraining it in the fabric of all investment processes and all risk management. And, I don't know if clients will, embed it in or make every asset a sustainable assets, which for us means you're writing a sustainability line in the investment guidelines. And honestly, it's up to our clients because we are a fiduciary. So we're kind of like taking our clients' leads. However, I will say, just given the way things are going, with sustainability, flows doubling last year what they were the year prior, and basically growing 10x the traditional ETF and mutual fund market, I certainly wouldn't bet against it.
Great. Well, I hope you're right. I hope it is just so pervasive that we don't even talk about it anymore. It's just second nature to all of us. Although that does seem to be way down the road. Hopefully, we're still in this business and we get to see it up close, but we will keep close tabs on it. Jessica Tan, BlackRock Head of Global Corporate Strategy, thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for joining us as well. Please mark your calendar for 2 more CNBC Evolve events coming up. May 26th, Innovations in Cybersecurity looks at efforts to protect our nation's cyber infrastructure and how government and private enterprises are working in tandem to anticipate threats before they happen. And then June 16th, CNBC spans the globe from Asia to Europe and the Americas, speaking to some of the biggest corporate leaders and innovators thriving in the new economy and driving forces specific to each region as well as the global economy. For more information and to register, visit cnbcevents.com. Until then, take care, everyone.